I am 33 years old, and it took me exactly that long to learn what I was worth to my own family. Everything blew up at my brother's engagement party, right in front of 60 guests. Nolan raised his glass, looked me dead in the eye, and told the entire room I was a liar, that I was faking my paralysis to milk them for sympathy. Then he marched over, grabbed the armrests of my wheelchair, and yanked hard. I hit the hardwood floor. My father stood towering over me, gritting his teeth, calling me the biggest failure of this family. My mother turned her face away, acting like the sight of her crippled daughter sprawled on the ground was some sort of plague she had to avoid to survive. But there was one thing none of them knew. For 2 years, I had been quietly collecting the one thing their money, power, and lies could never buy. Not a single person in that luxurious room could have guessed that in exactly 15 minutes, 5 police officers would bust through those doors, and every sound in the room would die. Let me rewind 2 years. Back to the version of me this family wanted the world to believe in. I live alone in a ground floor apartment about 25 minutes from the house I grew up in. Everything in it is built low, right within my reach. I drive my own car, a sedan modified with hand controls. I work as a paralegal. Remember that job title. It matters. Usually, when people hear the word wheelchair, their voices automatically drop an octave, talking to me in that soft, patronizing tone reserved for toddlers. I stopped correcting them because it takes energy I do not have, but my family was different. They never softened their voices. Every time they called, it was a warning. Let us not drag up the past. My mother would say, it was as if the past was a corpse we had all buried together, bound by an unspoken blood oath to never dig it up. The police report called it a single car accident. The whole town called it the sad story of the Merrill girl who lost control on County Road 12. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw headlights, not mine. A blinden, aggressive glare, roaring straight at me from a truck. A truck that did not exist on any piece of white paper with black ink. In those moments, I would press my palms hard against the ice-cold aluminum of my armrests. I tried to pin the memory down, clinging to it, so I would not go insane. My family had a word for that. They said I was confused. I started calling it evidence. Here was the narrative they brainwashed the world with. 2 years ago, on a rainy October night, I was driving home from work, lost control, and rolled into a ditch on County Road 12. I was in a coma for 9 days. When I woke up, my spine was shattered from the chest down. And the funny part was, the official report of my own accident had been written, signed, and stamped without me ever uttering a single word. By the time I could form a coherent sentence, the case was closed. My father had chatted with the responding officer, who just so happened to be his Thursday night poker buddy. My mother wept to the hospital social worker, claiming I was always a nervous, terrible driver. The concrete was poured before I could even lift my head off the pillow. I tried to tell them about the truck multiple times. My brother, Nolan, would squat by my bed, take my hand, and use that sickeningly warm voice of his, telling me I hit my head pretty hard. And there is no truck. After countless Thanksgivings where people would abruptly change the subject the second I opened my mouth, my family found a cleaner way to handle me. They stopped saying I was confused and started saying I was acting. She is just playing it up for attention. I heard my father tell my uncle in the kitchen once, loud enough for me to hear. He said, "Some people just love being the center of the universe." I sat in the living room, paralyzed in my chair, listening to my own flesh and blood turn my shattered spine into a Halloween costume. I kept quiet. I was beginning to realize that the deadliest weapon you can wield is not a scream, it is paperwork. My father was Merrill Halling, and Merrill Halling was my father. He built that trucking empire from nothing. By the time I grew up, it was a massive yard with 11 big rigs right off the interstate. He used to say the company was his real family. And his wife and kids were just shareholders. Nolan was the crown prince, and that was settled long ago. Right around the time of my crash, the company was chasing a historic contract that would double their fleet. My father lusted after that contract like it was his ticket to immortality. Anything that threatened the company was the enemy. So when his crippled daughter kept babbling about a truck that ruined her life, he did not see a bleeding wound. He saw a legal liability. He would stare at me across the dinner table, his jaw clenched. I knew he was doing the math. He was calculating me like a poorly balanced load. In this house, the company always got the deciding vote. And the company had decided my accident was a closed ledger. For 2 years, I let them think I gave up. The truth always finds you when people think you have gone deaf. That spring, Nolan got engaged. His fiancée, Brie, was a sweet, anxious school teacher. The whole family went into a frenzy with menus, seating charts, and renting a luxury lodge out at Carlton Lake. My mother finally had a project other than pretending I was fine. I sat at the end of the table, watching it all breeze past me. Nobody asked my opinion or wondered if the venue was wheelchair accessible. When I brought it up, my mother waved me off, telling me she would figure it out later. And not to complicate things, I pressed my palms against the freezing aluminum. My face remained blank. Then, my mother dropped the line she had been choking on for 2 years. She was folding napkins, not even looking at me. She said, "We just want one happy thing. After everything you have put this family through," I had flown through a windshield, my lower half severed from my brain, and somehow I was the one who put them through something. I did not argue. That night, I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and ripped open an envelope from my insurance company. It was a denial letter. They refused to approve a better wheelchair But buried deep in that dry, bureaucratic rejection was the first ray of light I had seen in 24 months. The letter stated I had the right to appeal, and to appeal, I had the right to request my complete file, all of it, including medical records, billing, and every piece of scene documentation. For 2 years, I had been brainwashed into thinking the past was a restricted zone. Now, a faceless insurance company was reminding me that the documents concerning my own flesh and blood belonged to me. As a paralegal, I knew exactly where to send the requests and exactly who was legally bound to cough them up. The next morning, I fired off the forms. I requested the hospital files, the invoices, and the full incident report from the emergency responders, not the flimsy 1-page summary my dad's poker buddy handed out. I demanded everything. I kept this completely hidden because an insurance denial had just handed me the one thing they feared most, which is paper, the kind with letterheads, a signature, and dates that does not lie. It took exactly 3 weeks for my dad to sniff it out. In this small town, everything leaks. A county clerk whispered to someone at church that the Merrill girl was pulling her accident files. By Sunday dinner, my dad knew. He did not yell. He just put his fork down and glared at me, asking what the hell I thought I was doing. I told him I was appealing an insurance denial. He growled that I was digging. My mother panicked and asked why I had to relive the past and why I was doing this to the family. And then my father delivered the magic spell that I would hear on loop for the next 2 months. He leaned back and spoke with absolute authority, telling me to let it go for the family, as if the family was some delicate glass flower I was smashing with a hammer, and not a concrete wall grinding my neck into the dirt for 2 years. They did not want me to heal. They just wanted me to shut up. I said, okay, lightly. Then I drove 25 minutes in the pitch black to my house and opened my mailbox. The first envelope was there. It was the full police report. The more I read, the colder my spine got. Not because of what was there, but what was not. There was not a single line ruling out a second vehicle. And there was another massive hole. The emergency medical services run sheet taken by paramedics at the scene was entirely missing. The police report was written by my dad's buddy, but the medical report was written by the medics. I sat at my kitchen counter at midnight, staring at that lethal gap. I grabbed a pen and filed a new request, demanding the original medical file directly. Requesting a medical report is a bureaucratic nightmare. That is where my family severely misjudged me. They thought my desk job made me weak, but it made me a patient, relentless cockroach. I knew exactly how to pull a single thread out of a massive pile of administrative garbage. While waiting, I started asking around. I found Marion, a retired paramedic who worked that October night. We got coffee, and she told me she remembered the damage looked wrong for a car that just drifted off the road. She said there was something on the driver's side door, and she wrote it down in the medical report. There it was again. The missing paper. Marion gave me another name, which was Walt Whitfield, an 81-year-old man who happened to drive by that night. I went to his house and he spilled everything. He was driving over the crest of Route 12 when he saw a dark pickup truck parked half on the shoulder with lights off, and my car upside down in the ditch. As he pulled over, the truck floored it and fled. He told me he got most of the plate and read it right to the young officer at the scene, but no one ever called him back. I sat in his kitchen, feeling the label of crazy girl slide right off my shoulders. A stranger had stood on that bank and seen exactly what I saw. I asked if he would go on the record, and he told me he had been waiting 2 years for someone to ask him that. A week later, my father stormed into my apartment. He hated this place because the lack of stairs insulted his pride. He did not even sit. He snarled that I went to see Walt Whitfield. I asked him if there was nothing to hide. Why was he foaming at the mouth? That is when the truth ruptured. He shouted, asking if I had any idea what this would do to the company. His voice was tight and suffocating, telling me they were inches away from the distribution contract. And if I dragged the cops into a 2-year-old wreck, I would drag the family name through the mud and lose the contract. So that was it. That was what had been crushing my neck. A damn contract. He looked at me with pure hatred, telling me to let it go for the family. Now, I heard it crystal clear to let it go for his company. I looked at the father I used to idolize, and the last soft piece of my heart froze solid. He was protecting a piece of paper that mattered more than his own child's shattered spine. I said, "Okay, Dad," and slammed the door in his face. Then I called a lawyer. Daniel Coleman was a seasoned attorney with a dingy office above a hardware store. I chose him because he did not look at me with pity. He listened and told me I did half his job for him. By bringing a witness and a stolen document, he sent out preservation letters to freeze all evidence and forced the county to release the medical report. Driving home, I got lost near the South Industrial Park. The sharp chemical stench of car paint and engine oil hit me from an open garage called Ostrander Auto Body. Dale Ostrander was my dad's best friend of 40 years. That day, I just locked the smell into my brain. On Thursday, the medical report landed on my table. It was a certified copy with a red stamp. I made myself a cup of coffee and took a deep breath because I knew once I read it, there was no going back. I pulled it out. It was short, brutal, and fatal. Under the scene description, the paramedics noted paint transfer along the driver's side door with paint color, inconsistent with the victim's vehicle. They noted severe intrusion damage on the side panel, indicating heavy external impact, inconsistent with a single car rollover. The paramedic even bolded a note recommending investigation of a possible second vehicle. There it was, foreign paint ground into my door, right where my body was crushed. For 2 years, they told me I was insane, but the medics who pulled me from the bloodbath wrote down the truth. Someone hit me and ran. I placed my hands flat on the cold table and whispered to the empty room that I was not faking. And there was a truck. Attorney Coleman moved like lightning. A second vehicle turned my accident into a felony hit and run with severe bodily injury. The only question left was, whose truck? I remembered Walt's dark truck, my dad's twitching jaw, and the chemical stench at the auto body shop. Paint shops have to keep invoices for taxes. It took Coleman's investigator 2 weeks to pull a copy of an invoice from the shop. The date was exactly 3 days after my crash. The details were to replace the front left bumper, hammer out dents, and do a full repaint. The vehicle owner was Nolan Merrill. My brother, it was paid in full, in cash, and noted in the owner's own handwriting as Raymond Merrill. My father. I stared at the 2 pieces of paper. They formed the exact sentence my family had forbidden me to speak. My brother crushed my spine. And 3 days later, my father used cash to erase the dent his golden boy left on his daughter. They whitewashed Nolan's truck, but they forgot one fatal detail. My totaled car had been rotting in a junkyard on the edge of town for 2 years, untouched. And that foreign paint from Nolan's truck was still permanently welded to my door. I took everything to the police station and threw it on Detective Put's desk. She read it twice and told me a felony hit and run with injury is not a parking ticket. With this new evidence, she was reopening the case. She gave me one strict order, which was silence, do not alert them, and do not let them know the ground beneath their feet was about to split open. And so I went quiet. I smiled at Sunday dinners and played the good, broken daughter who had let it go for the family. Meanwhile, under the table, forensics were matching the paint from the junkyard directly to Nolan's factory paint code. Walt was giving a recorded statement in an interrogation room. My silence was not surrender. It was a lit fuse. Then came the engagement invitation. It was not a peace offering. It was a stage. They wanted the crippled but compliant daughter sitting there, smiling in front of 60 guests to prove the family was perfect and spotless. I bought a navy blue dress, polished my wheelchair, and drove 25 minutes through the golden sunset to Carlton Lake. My hands were empty, but their entire lives were sitting in a manila folder on a detective's desk. My dad intercepted me in the gravel lot, crouching down with eyes full of calculation. He told me tonight is important for the company and not to cause a scene. My mother stood behind him, pleading for me to do it just for tonight, for the family. I looked at the manipulator and the coward, and I was not angry anymore. I told him clearly, I was not here to cause a scene. He smiled, thinking he had broken me, while my mother froze. Sensing my calm was a little too dead, the party was gorgeous, with soft music, elegant guests, and champagne. Nolan worked the room, laughing and holding Bree. While my dad held court at the bar, I parked in a quiet corner, watching them act. Time for the toast came, and Nolan tapped his glass. The room fell silent. He thanked everyone. And then his manipulative nature took over. He pointed his glass at me, wearing a mask of fake pity, and toasted his sister, who has suffered more than she lets on. Everyone looked at me, and I smiled. It would have ended there. If Bree's aunt had not walked over and asked me with genuine curiosity if I was born this way, or if it was the accident, I answered in a flat, emotionless tone that it was a car accident 2 years ago and someone hit me and ran. It was a normal, factual sentence. But Nolan was too close. He had been drinking all afternoon, and the word hit dropped on him like gasoline on a bonfire. His face turned beet red, and he snapped, telling me not to do this tonight. I looked up at him, saying nothing. And then my brother, in the middle of his own engagement party, threw his arms wide and roared to 60 gasping faces that I was faking it for sympathy. He yelled that I put myself in that chair and blamed the family for it. The music died and a glass slammed on a table. 60 faces snapped between me and him. I did not blink. I had waited exactly 2 years for him to spit those words out in a room full of witnesses. My dad rushed over like a hurricane. He needed to put out the fire, but instead of dragging his drunk son outside, he chose to crush the weakest link. He stood over me, blocking me from the guests, and hissed through his teeth, calling me the biggest failure of this family and telling me to shut my mouth. My mother stood by the cake with her face glued to the window, refusing to watch her daughter be humiliated. They insulted me, cursed me, and spit on my paralyzed legs in front of 60 people. That public execution was the greatest gift they ever gave me. I should have stayed quiet, but I am human. 2 years of venom rushed to my brain. I looked my brother dead in the eye and dropped the words light as a feather, telling him there was another car. And I know what color it was painted. His face drained of blood, shifting into blinding panic. A drunk, panicking man is a wild animal. He lunged, and before anyone could blink, he grabbed my wheelchair armrests, yanked them violently, and twisted. The chair flipped, and I slammed onto the hardwood. My hip and shoulder took the hit. While my dead legs tangled pathetically, the room shrieked. Glass shattered, and a woman screamed. Cutting through the chaos, I heard a calm, deep voice near the entrance. Bree's uncle was on the phone telling dispatch a man just assaulted a woman in a wheelchair, and to send units immediately. They expected me to cry and scream, but I planted one hand on the floor and slowly, calmly pushed myself up. A young waiter ran over to help me back into the seat. I thanked him. My dad was frantically cursing, trying to shove Nolan out the side door while my mother was clutching her chest. Hyperventilating, I sat perfectly straight with my hands folded neatly in my lap in absolute silence. My eerie calmness suffocated the room. 60 pairs of eyes stopped looking at me with pity and realized something was wrong. My father froze, staring at me with a trembling voice, asking what I did. I did not answer. Outside the window, the crunching of tires on gravel echoed loudly. 5 police officers busted through the double doors. The guests backed against the walls. My dad stepped up, using his old money authority, saying it was just a family misunderstanding. The lead officer cut him off, saying they got a call for an assault, and walked straight to me, asking if I was okay. This was the moment I had forged in blood and tears for 24 months. I reached into my side pouch, pulled out a business card, and held it up. I said, "My name is Heather Merrill, and that man is my brother, Nolan Merrill, who just threw me out of my wheelchair." I told the officer 60 people here can testify to that, and handed him my attorney's card. I took a breath and spoke slowly, letting every word echo. I said, 2 years ago, my brother rammed my car with his truck and fled the scene. I said, my family paid in cash to repaint his truck and destroy the evidence. And there is currently an active criminal investigation with the case number on the back of the card. The room exploded. Nolan screamed like a lunatic, calling me a liar. My dad's face was purple, shouting that this was a private family matter. The 2 most powerful men in the house were crumbling and screaming like cornered rats. I sat perfectly still. The lead officer stepped back, spoke quietly into his radio, and seconds later, his entire demeanor shifted. Dispatch confirmed there was an open felony file with my brother's name on it. The officer stepped toward Nolan and told him to step outside right now, and that was the final kill shot. From the corner of the room, Walt Whitfield stepped forward and announced loudly that he would testify to anyone. He said 2 years ago he stood by that ditch and watched a dark pickup flee the scene after hitting me, and he gave the plate to the cops that very night. 60 pale faces stared. As the grand illusion was ripped to shreds, the 2-year lie was stripped bare. My dad turned gray. My mother collapsed into a folding chair. And Nolan looked at me with the sheer terror of a man who knew his bill had finally come due. I rolled my chair forward just an inch and dropped one cold sentence. I said, "You all told me to let it go for the family." So I decided to let go of the family entirely. Bree ripped off her engagement ring and slammed it on the cake table. The officer slapped cuffs on Nolan, and the party was dead. My mother crawled over to my wheelchair, sobbing hysterically, saying she knew everything, but let my father do it. She broke down. I did not forgive her, and maybe I never will. But I reached out and tapped her shoulder once, because even an ending deserves a shred of mercy. I spun my chair to the door, rolled down the pathetic ramp, and lifted my own body into the driver's seat. I dismantled my wheelchair and threw it in the passenger side, just like I had done thousands of times in total isolation. I left behind a ruined party. And the monsters who stole my legs, the fallout was slow, but absolute. Nolan went to prison for felony hit and run with severe bodily injury. My dad and the auto shop owner faced a barrage of charges for tampering with evidence. The massive trucking contract vanished. The company went bankrupt, and every single truck was repossessed and auctioned off. The family was obliterated. I used the massive civil settlement to buy the best wheelchair on the market. I still work as a paralegal at that tiny kitchen table and get lunch with Walt sometimes. Justice is not a bright, spectacular fireworks show. Justice sounds like a heavy door finally slamming shut, locking the abusers inside, and I get to stay outside forever free.